Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, we have a topic I'm excited to learn about. It's near and dear to my heart, practical wisdom. I have Shane McLoughlin. He's at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Was there a couple years ago. Had a wonderful meal, Shane, at Dishoom. My family was there actually was in the UK. We were in London this time, but we had another meal over the holidays at Dishoom in London. And so I have a new favorite restaurant in Britain. But that is not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about you and your work. You have a new book. So Shane, let people know a little bit about you, and then we're going to jump in. We're going to talk some practical wisdom.
So, I'm Shane McLoughlin. I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham, and I work within a research center called the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues. And we're really interested in taking some of, in particular, but not exclusively, Aristotle's ideas about how to live a good life and how to translate that for educational purposes. But of course, as I'm sure you know, and your listeners know, education takes place more than just in the classroom. It's something that takes place in leadership. We work with people in the army, medical schools, all over the world. It's really exciting. And we get to share some of those ideas and develop them with experts in their own field. I also teach on the MA in Character Education, which is a part-time distance learning program. And we're very lucky because we get to have people from all over the world on that too. And of course, sometimes I feel like I learn more from my students than they learn from me because they're, of course, experts in their field. And it's a real pleasure to be able to share these ideas that in some ways are eternal, or they're certainly things that have stood the test of time, and then develop them empirically and then see them implemented in practice. So that's really what we do at the Jubilee Center. I'm a psychologist by background, and I get to work with philosophers, sociologists, teachers, and we get to think about how can we actually make these things practically relevant for real people today.
I left full-time academia about 2 years ago. I was a professor of management, and then have transitioned into primarily executive education for Southern Methodist University, which is in Dallas, Texas. And so I'm with professionals all the time. And a friend of mine, Tony Middlebrooks, said this quote. He said, "I don't know better, I know different." And that's how he starts his courses. I don't know better, I know different. So literally, I was with a number of executives this week in the automotive industry. And I said, I have not served as a general manager. I don't know better, I know different. And so I'm going to share with you some things I think are pretty cool that have really caught my attention. But to your point, in the spirit of kind of what you just said, I am learning just as much as they are as I kind of observe how some of these concepts are interfacing with them, right?
And this is the thing where I don't think any one individual necessarily has all of the knowledge that might be relevant here. We can give the nerdy depth, but then we try and create that bridge between the professionals who are doing good work but might want to infuse what they're doing with something, particularly for us in relation to professional ethics and practical wisdom, of course, as part of that. And, what we call the virtues more
Yes.
broadly, So obviously in business or in a school or whatever kind of organization it is, oftentimes you have these aspired professional identity of the organization where you've got core values, but oftentimes the distinction between values and virtues in practice is subtle. Whereas theoretically, we can say, well, let's put some shape on that and think about, which one do you mean and why? And it's a great starting point for a conversation and understanding really what matters to people at the end of the day.
Okay. So speaking about what matters, and I think this is where we're going to go a little bit deep. Bring us back to a little bit of Aristotle here. Let's refresh listeners. So we have, and I'm so excited to hear how you pronounce. I say phronesis, but I know that there's different pronunciations. So maybe bring us back to how Aristotle was thinking about knowledge and wisdom. There's a few different kind of branches of that. And then we'll jump in with your book and your work.
I mean, I always say phronesis, but sometimes I skip to just saying practical wisdom because, first of all, more people intuitively get what it means. Yeah. So, I mean, of course, there are different kinds of wisdom and, there's theoretical wisdom, sometimes called Sophia. There's more the sort of wisdom to almost instrumentally navigate goals. So you've got, this is where my pronunciation is going to really scupper me. And then of course you've got practical wisdom, which is more to do with how you can in daily life strive towards being your best self in context so that you're not trying to have, let's say, deontological rules, that might not apply in particular situations. I'm sure many listeners will know cases of that, especially in organizations where there's a rule about what's right and what's good, and it just doesn't apply in some situations. So I think practical wisdom, I like to think of it as the opposite of that, where we think about, okay, how can we attend to that nuance and do what's right and navigate those instances where our choice is between being honest and kind, and maybe we can be a combination of both to some degree, but the context usually dictates how much of each.
I love it. Okay, so talk a little bit about the book. And if you would, I mean, I just want to really pique the interest of listeners. So what are 2 or 3 things that kind of you are proud of that stand out for you in this piece of work? I'm just excited to learn how you're thinking about this.
I mean, to give a little bit of context for this, our work with character education, it's usually with, for example, medical schools or universities, or indeed regular schools at primary or secondary or elementary, as you might say, in high school. And oftentimes we say, character is developed in 3 different ways. It's caught, taught, and sought. It's caught from the environment that you're in. So this is your kind of social osmosis, your exemplars, your the people you try to emulate, the messaging that you see consistently, the culture of the place. So that's one part. But then there's taught, where of course you can teach some of these ideas directly and say, if I'm talking about a concept like, what is a value, what is a virtue, and what do we mean by the golden mean? And these different things that come up in these Aristotelian ideas, and of course other conceptions as well. So you can teach people to understand what that means and consciously attend to some of these features. And of course leaders too, because they're the ones who might help instantiate that from the top down, and mentors and managers and these kind of things too. But then of course you've got character sought, which is this idea that you want people to have their heart and autonomously seek to develop themselves in this way to be their best selves. And so I guess if that's what we do in big organizations, my question with this book was, I come from a background in psychology, and one of the areas that I used to study was values-focused psychotherapies. And in many different psychotherapies, to one degree or another, they explicitly foreground your values as being extremely important. If you look at logotherapy, that's all about doing what is meaningful despite suffering and so on. You look at act therapy, that's very values focused. But when I was doing research in that area, and I guess this is what brought me to this field, I kind of noticed that sometimes people have values that aren't good for themselves or other people or both. So for example, to some degree, you could argue that psychopaths have values, right?
Yeah, themselves, their own needs, right?
And so, the question is, are all values equally valuable? And it's like, well, that doesn't seem right. But nonetheless, there is this important question of we do need a diversity of preferences and so on. And so in fields like clinical psychology or counseling, or in this case, coaching, which I guess you could think of as the clinical psychology for when you don't necessarily have a mental health problem, but it's more well-being focused for your typical person. How does our character education work translate for one-to-one or one-to-few situations? Or if I have a teacher or I have a leader in a medical school or a manager or somebody who is in the army who might be a mentor to someone, or all of these other settings that we might work across, how can they take some of these key ideas and translate them for those one-to-one and one-to-few professions? And that's why I think coaching seems a good place to start, because it's non-clinical, but nonetheless it deals with similar sorts of settings, similar sorts of problems, but perhaps more flourishing focused than remediation of mental health problems focused, unlike clinical psychology. So yeah, that was kind of my motivation. And I guess the book is about that. And at its core, it really asks this question: what if your manager or your life coach or, somebody that you looked up to develop this practical wisdom, what if that was Aristotle? What would he say? What would that look like? And that was the premise.
What are 2 or 3 things you want listeners to know? Because I love this. It's almost a appreciative approach. We're not focused on the deficits or filling some, but we're here and we're trying to help you as an individual or a human. I mean, I'm going to use the word thrive, but from a coaching lens. So what are a few things you want folks to know about the text?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are some key points that, there's differences between values and virtues that are kind of important in practice. And I think, you can value things that are good or bad for you or others. And maybe they're good in the short term, but they're bad over time, or they're good in one context, but not another. And I suppose, there are different, I guess the problem with the values focused approach sometimes is that it's so individual and so almost preference based to some degree that it's very difficult to say that one value is better than another unless you've got some sort of a yardstick to measure it against, whether that's flourishing or thriving or whatever it might be.
Yep.
But in a virtue-focused account, you would focus on how can people flourish, and you can determine for example, which subset of values are conducive to flourishing. So you've got a criterion for selecting them. And so I suppose that is one of the things that oftentimes we use the language of values, because virtue language can sometimes seem a bit old-fashioned, but in practice, I think implicitly, oftentimes that's what we actually mean. So I guess that would be the first thing. I suppose the second thing would be, oftentimes we think about values or even virtues as universally a good thing, but we need to calibrate them in context, so we can't just, if you think about something like integrity, right? We always think about that as being one of the better virtues that someone could embody in an organization or otherwise. And of course you can have a deficit of that, which is, you're deceitful.
Yeah.
But what would an excess of a virtue look like?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really interesting idea from Aristotle called the golden mean. And the idea is that you could take a value or a virtue and say, well, what would this look like in excess? Where could this go off the rails a little bit? And so you could imagine somebody who has so much integrity to the point where they might become a little bit rigid and impractical, or, they might be seen as punishing and austere, or that kind of thing. Or even if you think about something like compassion, you can have too little of that where you don't care about other people's feelings. And we all know what that looks like. But then you could also potentially have too much to the point where you're so concerned with other people's needs that you might not focus on your own. And if you don't focus on your own, maybe you're a poor example for people you love. Maybe you are somebody who burns out. You are somebody who isn't discerning about when actually, this person has actually wronged me and I need to say something, right?
Yes.
So that golden mean idea, I think, is quite far reaching and I think useful. And we think,
Shane, I'd love to get I've never been able to have this question answered for me, and I'd just love to get your perspective. When we talk about the golden mean, so for instance, back to let's say integrity. Well, if I'm protecting human life and I am being deceitful and lying, in that context, it's to protect human life. I mean, you could go to World War II examples from situations that happened that are very, very relevant. It's that knowing when, right? It's that practical wisdom of, am I intentionally deciding to be deceitful? Because in this context, it's probably the best decision for what is going on. So can that phrasing golden mean be confusing to some? Or how do you think about that phrasing? Is it always a mean, or is it just where on this spectrum should I land for this situation? Does that make sense, that question?
So the language of golden mean is probably a little bit misleading in the sense of it's not a perfect middle, because then you can kind of become a little bit obscurantist at that point. What it means is you're finding the right amount at the right time for the context that is conducive to flourishing. And so Aristotle really emphasized this idea of eudaimonia, or what we might call the good life, which is more than subjective well-being. You know, oftentimes psychologists, and I bear some of the responsibility as a psychologist here, we focus on subjective well-being. But of course, people can have subjective well-being while the world burns around them, you know? And so oftentimes we talk about flourishing as encompassing that, but also objective well-being. There's things that you actually need in your life for it to go well. And so if you're thinking about that wider conception of flourishing, not just now, but potentially iteratively, and potentially for other people to flourish alongside you, then you can use that as, in some sense, a yardstick against which you decide the applicability of a virtue in context.
Okay, so it seems to me that intentionality is an important part of this whole conversation. Am I intentional, at least, in the level of deceit I need to employ in this situation? It's a conscious decision I've chosen, given what I know and my objectives. But is that word intentionality feel right to you?
I mean, to take it right back down to earth, we've all heard of white lies, for example, where, you can tell the truth, but, we've all met those people who, for example, say they hurt everybody's feelings unnecessarily. They're abrasive, and they say, oh, I'm just telling the truth. That's just the kind of person I am. And I'm like, I could tell you another kind of person you are, but you might not like that. And I think that's the idea, that actually you're turning a virtue into a vice contextually because it is potentially corrosive to flourishing, right?
Yeah.
So that's where I think that concept is quite far-reaching, because it stops people from being too rigid when oftentimes previously some of these ways of being might have served us really well, but we've only been around so long, and we often encounter new contexts where actually, there's another way of being that would actually help to navigate this situation in service of everybody else's good,
I think it's, again, to your point, I mean, we can get to a point where we come off as dogmatic, or we can get to a point where we're going to lose people. We think we're showing up in the quote unquote right way to help others thrive or flourish. And in reality, maybe softening that a little bit and choosing a different space to enter is actually going to be more beneficial in the long run. I mean, I think sometimes in my mind, or at least in my experience, some of these, it can be kind of taken to an extreme, right? It's almost is it Kant categorical imperative that you always, am I getting that correctly? You always behave, that you never lie.
I mean, we actually did a study in 2023 where we asked a representative sample of UK participants, how did they make their career decisions when they were leaving school or university, if they went to university? And we kind of coded them for this kind of Kantian deontological reasoning, the utilitarian reasoning, where it's about maximizing the amount of good, and then virtue ethical reasoning, which is slightly more motivated by being a good person. And it turned out that Kantian reasoning negatively predicted flourishing. So people who had this sort of rigid rule-based reasoning, actually they were likely to be flourishing less. And when we look at the psychotherapy research literature on rule-governed behavior, we see the exact same thing, that actually if you're overly governed by those rules, then it tends to not work out too well for you. Coincidentally, virtue-based reasoning was most conducive to flourishing, which you would expect considering both concepts are essentially Aristotelian.
What else do you want folks to know?
For a long time, it's over 2,300 years now, right, since Aristotle was about. And it's only relatively recently that we've started to psychometrically tease apart the structure of practical wisdom and what that involves.
Nice.
We've got a big study that came out last year. It's got 4,000 people. And we've tried to tease apart what are the actual components of practical wisdom and think about, in the case of the book, the paper is freely available. You can have a look. But in the case of the book, it's about trying to take that back down to earth and say, what can an individual do? And so we try to walk through that. And then I suppose the other major thing is the importance of friendship, which doesn't get enough attention either in workplace discussions or in well-being discussions. And this sort of raises this idea that, you've got to surround yourself with good people in a way and distinguish between different kinds of friends, because this Aristotelian idea is that there are at least three kinds. There's the one where, you just like hanging out with them, you go for a beer with them or whatever it is. And then there's the second kind, which is, it's more transactional, so I get something from you and I'm expected to give you something back. And then, of course, there's the character friend, where it's not about you. It's just that you actually care about the other person's long-term welfare. And so we talk through what that might look like in terms of a coaching conversation, as well as, of course, management conversations, mentorship. And the idea, of course, is that Aristotle, of course, was a mentor for Alexander the Great. And that's quite a partnership. And thinking about, what might their relationship have looked like? And think about if the people that you care about are going to, quote unquote, conquer, not in a hopefully destroying half the world kind of way, but in a way where it's humane and it's, long-term conducive to flourishing and integration, then that could be a useful lens to think about how people relate to one another. So I guess those are the key things that I would highlight that are in there. And that's all, of course, as evidence-based as I can manage to get it.
I think, and especially from the standpoint of you use the phrasing caught, taught, and you use the phrasing caught, taught, and sought. And I love that. But yes, if we're surrounding ourselves with people, with friends who are in pursuit of flourishing, who are of good character, who are intentional about their decisions, it's probably a heck of a lot easier for us to catch that and become that, right?
You want to set up your environment to be the kind of person that you want to become. And, I mentioned that 2023 study earlier. And one of the things that people did, the people who were really flourishing, was they picked a job where they would encounter the kinds of people that they might like to become like, So this kind of follows through there as well. And empirically, that seems to be conducive to flourishing as far as I can tell. And and it's okay to have the other kinds of friends. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But you kind of want to have the other ones too, and not make category errors here, because then, of course, you have these asymmetrical relationships with people, and that can lead to heartache on one side or the other, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. Tell us a little bit about practical wisdom, because I called the podcast Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders, not having really explored it in depth. So
Nice.
I just loved the concept, right?
Yeah.
So full transparency, listeners, we're like 340 episodes in or whatever it is. So how do you think about the concept? And then we'll begin to wind down our time.
Sure. So, practical wisdom, I suppose the point of it is to try to think about how to navigate situations where there isn't always a straightforward response. So the easy example is, somebody asks you, do you like my new shirt? And you're thinking, oh gosh, I really don't, but I don't want to hurt their feelings. And versions of that you see, you can have values that clash, and you can't have both 100% at the same time. And it's thinking about how do you adjudicate between different goods there. And the idea is that practical wisdom, it's almost like, this is something that we've kind of said a lot, but it's thinking about, being the conductor of the orchestra of virtues, right? So you've got different virtues that can apply in different amounts at different times, and you want to harmonize those in service of flourishing. And I suppose when we tease that apart psychometrically, we looked at a lot of the scholarship on practical wisdom and thought about what might that involve plausibly. And so then in psychology and in psychometrics, what you can do is an empirical analysis to see how different questions group together. And the idea behind that basically is, I could ask you 3 questions. Do you smile a lot? Do you enjoy your life? And do you laugh a lot? Right? 3 different questions. However, if for every person that answers that question, the answer to one question is indicative of the answer to all the others, you're kind of asking the same question, which is something like, am I happy?
Yeah.
And so when we created, I think it was almost a couple of 100 items for practical wisdom and what that might plausibly involve, we find that actually it's much more nuanced than a lot of previous scholarship realized, where there are actually 10 different aspects of it.
Wow.
We were able to find out that they're not all equally important. They're not all equally central. But the things that were central were things like, do you have a picture of what your best self might look like, and are you genuinely striving towards that? So it's very identity based and aspirational based. Other ones were to do with deliberation. So you need to make a decision. It's not necessarily difficult. Are you taking the time to ask yourself, do I have all the information I actually need to properly make this decision, or do I need to seek new information here?
Wow.
That, practically speaking, translates very well for something like practical wisdom coaching, because you're like, okay, here's a check and balance I could potentially talk about. And then there were other things like emotional regulation, which seemed less important, which was interesting. And that went against some previous research, because you would expect, hey, I need to be able to control my emotions to make the right decision. And it's like, no, it turns out that's an important part of making the right decision, that actually part of what informs your decision is the kind of person you want to be, and what flourishing might look like for you, that blueprint of your good life, and also how you feel about it, because obviously our emotions give us feedback from our actions and tell us whether we've done right or wrong. We have that conscience aspect. So there is this idea in practical wisdom that if we want to become a good person or develop a virtue, it is iterative, right? It's habitual. So, you might not be able to be the most gregarious person right now, but maybe you can start with a relatively low bar of just sort of vaguely smiling at a stranger. Do you know what I mean? So this kind of mirrors this idea of these micro habits. You see, that book Atomic Habits is really popular. And the same is true in the personality literature. If you want to change personality, you need to do it one baby step at a time, and you have to actually complete the action. So you have to live it out bit by bit. Yeah. And did you say there was somebody at, was it Southern Methodist University?
I'm at Southern Methodist University in executive education in the School of Business, but I do know of a personality scholar who's at SM.
Yes.
He did a TED Talk that I really enjoyed.
Yes, there's a chap who's researched, I think his name's Nathan Hudson, and he's one of the big leaders in this volitional personality trait space, and I admire his work very much. And that is really congruent with Aristotelian ideals of how, ideals about how you can actually become a better person, right? It's very congruent. And it's interesting how 2,300 years later, it all still seems to broadly match up. We can add a little bit more nuance. We've got technology now and methods that maybe the ancients didn't have, but it's so broadly congruent. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
But so practical wisdom, multifaceted, but some parts seem to be more important than others. Now we find that it predicts flourishing reliably. It also predicts things like dark personality traits like Machiavellianism and sadism, not positively, negatively so. So in other words, if you're higher in practical wisdom, you tend to be lower in those things.
Good.
Yeah. If it went the other way, that would have been awkward for us if the data looked like that. But nonetheless, thankfully, that was it. And interestingly, there are other ideas of what it means to be a good person, like this idea. I don't know if you're familiar with moral foundations theory.
No.
This is Jonathan Haidt and colleagues' approach. And they're suggesting that we have these sort of almost innate preferences towards things like care or justice. And that actually, when we say something like this is good or bad, what we're really saying is, yay for that thing, boo for that thing, based on an innate kind of predisposition to liking one thing or another. So we took their best measure and we tried to predict flourishing. And then we took our practical wisdom measure and tried to predict flourishing over and above that. And it added so much extra explained variance. And what that means for practical purposes is that their measure is good, but actually this idea of practical wisdom seems to add something over and above that in terms of explaining what flourishing might entail. And that, I think, was encouraging for us. And we're very lucky that, our colleagues have taken our measures and translated into Chinese and Spanish and all sorts. And so this research is very much ongoing. And I think other people are certainly going to be the stars in that particular area. But I'm glad to be able to play a small part in understanding practical wisdom as such.
Well, I have so much respect. I think it was Ryan Holiday who has made Stoicism just really sexy. Now, it's going to be Shane who makes Aristotle,
Okay. I'm going to need a sexy internet avatar. Yeah.
This is so critical and foundational to, I believe, human existence. How do we help humans live their best lives? How do we help humans live into lives of purpose and meaning? Of course, that has a direct relationship to why leadership is so incredibly important. And especially from that caught, taught, and sought aspect, the individuals in those positions of authority, who they are matters a lot. It matters a lot.
Yeah.
As you kind of reflect on this conversation, what's the practical wisdom for listeners?
Most of us are basically well-intentioned, aren't we? Or at least to ourselves, we seem like we are. And I think sometimes it's thinking about where, okay, we all have deficits. We all have things that we're working on and we're not the best at, whether it's as a professional, whether it's at work, or at home or whatever it is. But we also have these things that we're kind of proud of ourselves for. And sometimes it can be useful to develop those things. But sometimes it's just helpful to think about in which context may I express who I am, the things that I can't change about myself, but in ways that are more conducive to flourishing, I would say, because then you're thinking about it as not being about you, but it's being about how some version of you can fit with what is good. Because if you're working with somebody individually, you're a manager, or if you're in a relationship, or you've got friends, you can think about, okay, what is the version of me that helps us both to flourish here, or maybe more wide than that. And for me, that's the big takeaway that I hope people will get, and just a seed to sow. And if that resonates with you, I think that's where our other work might be of interest. And if not, that's okay too.
Well, Shane, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And for listeners, we have some links in the show notes for you to learn more. Let's do this again. Let's have another conversation. I appreciate you.
I'm really grateful to be here, and thanks to all the listeners for listening too.
Okay, be well. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.